Hello everyone and welcome to this video tutorial on delegated legislation. In our previous topic of parliamentary lawmaking, we learnt how a bill becomes an Act of Parliament, and we saw that to turn a bill into an Act, we need the cooperation of the House of Commons, the House of Lords and the Monarch. So Parliament has to pass an Act of Parliament. What we're going to see in this tutorial is that delegated legislation is made by bodies other than Parliament, but with the authority of Parliament passed through what's known as an enabling or a parenting act. And in this way, Parliament still limits and controls the power that's passed to these other bodies by stipulating how it may be used. If we start by looking at our definition of delegated legislation, as I've already mentioned, delegated legislation is law made by some person or body other than Parliament, but with the permission of Parliament. It's sometimes known as secondary legislation, and in order to make delegated legislation, the body other than Parliament needs to use what's called an enabling act or a parenting act to enable them to make the law. Controls of delegated legislation, which we're going to look at in this tutorial, and if it's found that the person or body who's been making this delegated legislation has gone beyond the powers given to them under the Enabling Act, that can be reviewed in the courts under judicial review, and they can be deemed to be ultra vires or beyond power. Important to consider why delegated legislation is needed in the first place. Firstly, we can see here that delegated legislation is important because it saves limited parliamentary time. This means that it avoids overloading the limited parliamentary timetable because delegated legislation can be amended and/or made without having to pass an Act of Parliament, which, as we've seen from a previous topic, can be time-consuming. Delegated legislation also allows for rapid change because changes can be made to the law without the need to have a new Act of Parliament, and it further avoids Parliament having to spend a lot of their time on technical matters such as the clarification of a specific part of the legislation. Another key advantage of delegated legislation is it means that the law can be made by experts with appropriate technical knowledge in that field. Another advantage here is that emergency legislation can be passed quickly. And this is really important because delegated legislation will often deal with an emergency situation as it arises without having to wait for an act to be passed through Parliament to resolve the particular situation. And examples over the years of this have included things like delegated legislation created to deal with the foot and mouth crisis, and also even the coronavirus pandemic. Delegated legislation is much more flexible than an Act of Parliament, and it enables minor changes to be made, for example, variations in sentences, and we're going to have a look at that a little bit later in this video. We also have control over delegated legislation. So we have judicial review, which can be sought by parties who have locus standi, i.e. an interest in challenging the delegated legislation. Another reason why it's needed is local knowledge. So a local authority can make law in accordance with what their locality needs, as opposed to having one law across the board, which might not suit every particular area. And if you think about MPs in London making laws, they're not necessarily going to be as aware of local issues in the north, for instance. So it's better to delegate that power to people who are living in the north who better understand the local issues. And as we've already touched on, withdrawing or amending delegated legislation is much easier than withdrawing or amending an Act of Parliament. So it's a very flexible type of lawmaking. This diagram shows that there are three different types of delegated legislation which you need to be aware of. Firstly, we've got orders in council, and these are made by a body called the Privy Council, who's a group of 300 past and present government ministers that includes all the leaders of the main political parties, the Speaker of the House of Commons, and even the Queen. And the Privy Council acts using power delegated by the Emergency Powers Act and the Civil Contingencies Act. And they act in times of public emergency to transfer powers from one area of the government and when Parliament's not sitting. Statutory instruments are made by government ministers in their departments. For example, the Secretary of State for Transport will be delegated the responsibility to make statutory instruments on their area of expertise. And this type of delegated legislation is used for adding detail and updating existing laws, bringing EU law into force, and setting a starting date for an Act of Parliament. The third type here, bylaws. Bylaws tend to have the greatest impact on our day-to-day lives. Bylaws are made by local governments such as city and town councils, as well as some private companies and charities. This allows those with the greatest knowledge about a particular area's problems to have a say. For an example, Manchester City Council was given authority to make certain bylaws by the Local Government Acts of 72 and 82 and use them to ban all skating and rollerblading on footpaths and highways. But we're going to have a look at each of these types of delegated legislation in a bit more detail now. Start by looking at orders in council then. You'll notice on my PowerPoint there are links to other video clips which once you've finished this tutorial you can go away and have a look at these. So the Law Bank has made some videos on delegated legislation which are quite good, so if you open my PowerPoint, click on the links, that will take you on to some other videos. The Queen and the Privy Council have the authority to make orders in council. And the Privy Council, as we've said, is made up of the Prime Minister and other leading members of the government. This type of delegated legislation effectively allows the government to make legislation without going through Parliament. Its main use today is to give legal effect to European directives. However, the Privy Council has power to make law in emergency situations under the Emergency Powers Act 1920 and under the Civil Contingencies Act 2004. So these are the parent or enabling acts which allow orders in council to be made in these situations. An example of an order in council from 2004, an order in council was used to change the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 to make cannabis a Class B to a Class C drug. You can see here this not very nice image is from the foot and mouth crisis. So this is another example of an emergency situation where an order in council was made in order to deal with a crisis at that time. Statutory instruments refers to the rules and regulations made by government ministers. And these ministers are given authority to make regulations for areas under their particular responsibility. A good example of what this means is that the Lord Chancellor has power regarding the legal aid schemes, while the Minister for Transport is able to deal with necessary road traffic regulations. The use of statutory instruments is a major method of lawmaking, as there are about 3,000 statutory instruments brought into force each year. There have been lots of statutory instruments brought about to help with the coronavirus pandemic. To give you a couple of examples, we have the Misuse of Drugs Coronavirus Amendments relating to the supply of controlled drugs during a pandemic regulation, and also the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions in England Amendment Regulations of 2020. So these statutory instruments were put into place to help control the situation during the pandemic. The massive advantage, of course, is that they can be brought into force quickly and they are easy to amend, easy to change. And on this slide, I've given you some further examples of statutory instruments which have been made under the Road Traffic Act. The one that you're probably well aware of is the Fixed Penalty Offences Order, where people can be given a fixed penalty if they're using the mobile phone when driving. And you can see here as well, for example, under PACE, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984, the Secretary of State can issue codes of practice relating to police powers of arrest, stop and search and detention. So the Enabling Act is PACE, so that Act of Parliament sets out the rules, but the Secretary of State can change codes of practice, little things like what do the police have to say when they arrest you. And it's useful that those things are in codes of practice as a statutory instrument because we can change those codes quite quickly, whereas it would be much more challenging and take a lot longer to change PACE, this Act of Parliament. We can leave that intact and just change the rules within it. Let's have a look at the third type of delegated legislation then, bylaws. Bylaws can be made by the local authorities to cover matters within their own area. For example, West Yorkshire County Council can pass laws affecting the whole county, but a district or a town council can only make bylaws for its district or town. Local bylaws can involve traffic controls, such as parking restrictions. Bylaws can also be made by public corporations and certain companies for matters within their jurisdiction, which involve the public. And this means that bodies such as the British Airports Authority and the railways can enforce rules about public behaviour on their premises. An example of this could be the smoking ban on the London Underground system. Some other examples, this is one that I'm familiar with, being from Southport. There is a bylaw that says skateboarding is prohibited on the Princess Diana Memorial Gardens. And I'm well aware of that because my cousin once got in trouble for skateboarding there. So you can see that with bylaws, the advantage is they're being made by people who know that local area. And so the laws or the rules that are made can be appropriate to that particular area. So now we've looked at the three types of delegated legislation. I just want to remind you what we've seen. We've looked at orders in council, statutory instruments and bylaws. A really useful revision activity at this point would be to create yourself a table to summarise the difference between those three types of delegated legislation. Please watch the next video tutorial in which we'll look at the different ways that delegated legislation is controlled, which is extremely important given that this is law made by bodies other than Parliament.